I came home with a bag of warm bread and a bottle of milk sweating in my hand. The hallway smelled like old wood and something sweet, probably the chocolate shop downstairs. But taped to my front door was a white envelope I hadn't seen before. Bank letterhead. Thick paper. Stamped urgent. I held it in my lap under the kitchen light, next to the chair my husband used to sit in. The one with the frayed arms and the coffee stain from 2003. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside were 4 pages. The first line read, "Mortgage application, 305 East, 146th Street, Apt. PH4. That was my address. Our home. The place we'd lived for 35 years. The signature at the bottom wasn't mine. It was hers. Yolanda Delgado. She hadn't mentioned this. Not once. I stared at her name until the lines blurred. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just got up, set the kettle on the stove, and reached for the chipped coffee mug with the faded blue roses. The kitchen was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a bus turning the corner. The kind of quiet that follows something breaking. I poured the coffee black, sat at the table alone, and watched the steam rise. Yolanda had moved in after my husband passed. She said it was just to help me get by with groceries, errands, the loneliness. Now she wanted the deed, too. I took a sip. It burned a little. That felt real. Then I did what I hadn't done in a long time. I reached for the old phone book in the drawer. And I called Miriam. She hadn't changed her number in 20 years. Her voice on the other end was tired but steady. "Corinne?" she said. "It's been a while." Yes. Yes, it had. I told her everything. And when I hung up, the silence wasn't so heavy anymore. It had shape. And weight. And a name. Mine. If your name disappears from your own home, what else can they take from you? The curtains in my living room still hang just where I hemmed them. Winter of '91. I remember the ache in my fingers. After hours at the sewing machine, and the hush that settled over our apartment. Each time snow fell outside that balcony window, he'd sit behind me, one leg crossed over the other, playing that old accordion. The keys were chipped, but the sound never faltered. It was warm in that room, not just from the radiator, but from the music, from the way he'd watch me work, and say nothing at all, because silence between us meant comfort, not absence. Some nights, I'd bring home fabric scraps from the shop, lace from Paris, beaded tulle, even bits of ivory satin. He'd hold them up to the light. "Too sheer," he'd joke, "unless you're making a gown for a ghost." And I'd laugh. A full-bodied, belly laugh. The kind that doesn't live in me anymore. I was known back then as someone with miracle hands. My clients would cry, and I would patch together their panic, their nerves, their dreams. I stitched futures, and I believed that counted for something. Our apartment, it wasn't big, but it breathed. Each corner had fingerprints, memories folded like linen. In every drawer. The rug in the hallway? He tripped on it the night we danced too long. The nick in the kitchen table? That came from our first Thanksgiving. He tried to carve the turkey with a bread knife. And the closet, the one now half empty, still holds the last wedding dress I ever made. Unworn. Cream silk. Shoulder buttons. Timeless. Then, he left. Not by choice. Not in anger. Just gone. A sudden rupture in our ordinary day. One breath, then none. I still remember the stillness. After the paramedics shut the door, the way sunlight hit his empty chair. At 3:17 p.m. I sat there. For hours. Not crying. Not blinking. Just forgetting how to move. I made myself tea. but forgot to drink it. It sat there, cooling beside the unpaid bills, and the flyer for a church fair we never went to. In the days that followed, the house stopped making sound. The radiator went quiet. The accordion stayed locked in its case. I tried to fill the hours. I really did. But grief is not loud. It whispers. And it settles into the fabric of things. Until even your own reflection looks like someone else's life. Then came Yolanda. She arrived with a bright paper bag from the little organic market down the block. Inside were 2 apples, a half loaf of sourdough, and almond milk. I never asked for. "Hi, Titi Corinne," she said. Like no time had passed at all. I hadn't seen her in 10 years. Not since her father's funeral. She used to braid her hair into uneven pigtails and sit under my sewing table, playing with fabric scraps, while I hemmed sleeves and whispered to brides. Now she stood taller than me, with sharp eyeliner, and a way of moving that made the walls feel too small. "I thought you could use some help," she said, placing the bag on my counter, like it had always been hers. I didn't stop her. Maybe it was the way the silence had grown so thick, or the way her eyes softened when she saw the dust on the coffee table we never used to let gather. She came again the next day, and the next, brought takeout, changed the water in the vase, emptied the trash. Without asking, she started staying late. Said she hated her roommate, the noise in her building, the smell of mildew in her hallway. By the second week, she had a toothbrush in my bathroom. By the third, a suitcase. I let it happen slowly, like fog. You don't notice when it thickens, only when the view is already gone. She filled the apartment with new sounds. Phone calls at midnight, pop music from the shower, heels clicking across my wooden floors. One afternoon, I found the accordion in a box, labeled storage. I asked about it. She said the living room needed to breathe. Another day, my wedding photo was missing from the bookshelf. In its place was a framed poster of a cactus that read, "Grow through what you go through." The air had shifted. My lace curtains now hung beside LED string lights. My kitchen smelled like takeout and hair product. I told myself she meant well, that she was young, that she didn't know what it meant to grow roots in one place. But every time she brought home something new, she took something old away. And I let her, because I thought maybe it was what people did when they got older. Made room, got smaller, tried not to be in the way. One morning, I noticed the smell of chocolate was no longer coming through the windows. She had closed them, said it was drafty. That same week, she mentioned the word renovate. "This place has so much potential," she said over coffee I didn't ask her to make. "We could open up this wall, make a breakfast bar. You'd love it, Titi." I smiled. Or something close to it. That afternoon, I opened the hall closet to reach my raincoat, and found my old albums, stacked beneath a scented candle, and 3 throw pillows I had never seen before. On top, a post-it note. Sort later. The albums weren't labeled anymore. The little tags I had written in ink. Summer 1987, Coney Island. First dress, 1993. They had fallen out. Pages had shifted. Memories now lived out of order. Later that evening, I saw Yolanda on the phone in the hallway. She was speaking softly. "No, she won't notice. It's just paperwork. She never looks at that stuff." I didn't ask, but the sound of her voice stayed with me. A day later, she asked if I had ever thought about planning ahead. "You know," she said lightly, "about power of attorney, or adding someone to the deed, in case something ever happens." I looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, I truly looked. There was something in her eyes. Not malice, but calculation. Not cruelty, but certainty. Like she had already decided what my life was going to look like. Like I was just a chapter she could rewrite. I said I needed to think about it. She nodded, told me she understood. Then she left the room, humming to herself. The next morning, a letter from the bank was taped to the door. White envelope. Red stamp. My name not on it. I stood there with my grocery bag, keys still in hand, staring at the edge of a signature. Through the windowed fold. Yolanda Delgado. I didn't open it. Not yet. I sat at the table instead, poured myself a cup of black coffee, held it between both hands, even as it cooled. And I asked myself, if someone slowly unravels your home, thread by thread, do you only notice once you're the last stitch left? The first time I wasn't invited. It was for something small. Yolanda had a few friends over. Just a movie night, she said. You'll be bored, Titi. It's all their silly reality shows. She handed me a mug of warm tea and pointed toward the balcony. I lit the candle out there. Figured you'd enjoy the breeze. I stood outside in my cardigan, watching shadows flicker across the window as they laughed inside at something I couldn't hear. It was just one evening, I told myself. But it happened again. The next weekend. And again. The week after that. One night, I found my knitting basket tucked behind the couch. Out of sight. The yarn had come undone. Like it had been moved in a hurry. My slippers, once by the door, were now in the hallway closet. She said the entryway needed to feel open. I began to notice little shifts. My radio, always set to the classical station, suddenly played top 40. The armchair I read in was moved to the corner, facing the wall. I thought it opened up the space. She said, adjusting her new diffuser. That puffed out something sweet and sharp. A scent I didn't recognize. Once, I returned from the corner store to find the apartment full of people. Strangers, mid-20s, sipping cocktails and resting their bags on my old cedar chest. No one looked up. When I walked in, Yolanda waved me off with a grin. Oh, Titty. I thought you were going to be gone longer. Do you want to come sit in my room instead? It's quieter there. So I did. I sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the collection of perfumes, and ring lights, and little bottles of pills in clear trays. I heard the muffled beat of music through the wall, and realized not a single laugh belonged to me. No one had asked where I'd been. No one missed me in that room. I used to be the one who made sangria in a big glass pitcher, the one who chose the music, and kept a stack of coasters ready on the coffee table. Now my seat was gone, replaced, not in anger, not even on purpose, just quietly, the way fog fills a house. Before you even notice, you've lost the view. It wasn't just the gatherings. It was the way she began talking about the apartment, as if it no longer belonged to me. She called it our place. When speaking to her friends on the phone, our view of the Bronx, our hallway, our energy. She even gave one of the guest mugs to her friend Leo, the one with the tiny chip on the rim. That cup had been his favorite, my husband's. It was just a mug, I told myself. But the handle still carried the imprint of morning after morning, his thumb pressed just so. I went to dust the bookshelves one morning and found something missing. Not something small, something central. The framed family photo from our anniversary party in 2003. The one where I wore that maroon dress with the pearl clasp, where we all stood on the rooftop, laughing into the dusk light. Gone. In its place was a decorative mirror, round, gold-rimmed, reflecting back a face I hardly recognized anymore. I asked her about it. She smiled like I'd forgotten something obvious. Oh, it didn't go with the new theme, she said. I put it in storage. You said you didn't like that photo anyway, remember? I didn't remember saying that. I wouldn't have. That photo was the last one, where my husband looked strong. His arm curled gently around my back. His tie slightly crooked. He never did care for collars. I found the frame a few days later, leaning against the wall in the coat closet. Face down, behind a stack of boxes, labeled Misk. The glass was cracked. Not broken. Just a small fracture. Right across his smile. I didn't say a word. Not to her. Not to anyone. I dusted it off, tucked it beneath my bed, like a secret, and made a promise that I wouldn't ask again, that I would notice. Silently. Another Sunday, Yolanda hosted a brunch, and I wasn't even told. I woke up to the sound of clinking glasses, and the smell of scrambled eggs, cooked with a spice I didn't recognize. I stepped into the kitchen in my robe, only to find my place at the table occupied. A man I didn't know sat there, scrolling on his phone, a mimosa in his hand, his chair tilted back on two legs. No one made eye contact. No one moved. And I realized, it wasn't just my seat they had taken. It was my presence. My role. I had become the afterthought in a story I used to write. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found Yolanda standing over the fireplace. She held a small box in her hands. It was cardboard, creased along the corners, labeled in black marker, Misk. Her eyes lit up when she saw me watching. Oh, just clearing some clutter, she said, as if that explained everything. Random knickknacks. Nothing you need. I moved closer. Inside the box was the Matchbox car my husband used to keep on the mantel. A tiny blue convertible, with one wheel missing, and a chipped windshield. It wasn't worth anything. Not to anyone else, but to us. It was the first car he ever owned. The one he drove to New Jersey in 1976. With a quarter tank of gas. And a cassette deck that only played salsa. He used to say, freedom didn't have to be fast. Just yours. I had forgotten it was even there. Until I saw it in her hand, about to be tossed. I reached forward, took it without a word, and placed it gently back on the mantel. She stared at me. Not with anger, but with that polished pity people reserve for the elderly. Like I was too sentimental to be taken seriously. She didn't apologize. She just moved on. That evening, I took a longer route on my walk. Past the laundromat, where the machines clanged like memory, and the corner store, with the pastelillos he used to sneak into my grocery bags. The wind smelled like detergent and asphalt. It reminded me of the Bronx I used to know. Gritty. Noisy. Mine. When I came back, the hallway was dim, and Yolanda was on the phone again. That same hushed tone she used when she forgot I still had ears. No, she doesn't use the living room anymore. Honestly, it's like she's not even here. I'm doing her a favor. I didn't move. Didn't interrupt. Just stood there, letting each word scrape softly across my ribs. It wasn't just the words. It was the confidence. The ease. Like she had already rewritten the story. And I had been quietly edited out. 2 days later, a text buzzed on my old phone. Hey, just a heads up. We're doing a mini photo shoot for the apartment next week. Just for practice. Don't worry. 1. Photo shoot. Practice. ISC. I stared at the screen until it went dark. No reply. Instead, I walked to the hall closet and opened the box she had marked Misk. Inside was my husband's old gray scarf, frayed at the ends, still soft, still faintly carrying that hint of spice from the cologne he never finished. That night, I wrapped it around my shoulders, even though the heat was still on, and I sat, alone, in the chair they had pushed to the corner, its back now facing the wall. The silence used to comfort me. Now it felt like a sentence. And I asked myself, would you beg for a place at their table? Or would you protect your own pride? The first thing that felt off was the mailbox key. It used to turn smoothly. Now it scraped like something didn't want to open. Inside, the envelopes weren't addressed to me. At least, not all of them. I found one from the bank, marked, duplicate copy, requested by client. But I hadn't requested anything. I stood by the hallway window, envelope pressed to my chest, listening to the muffled thump of music from Yolanda's room. She laughed, somewhere behind the closed door, as if nothing in the world had shifted. But something had. I could feel it. I placed the envelope on the kitchen table, next to the bowl of bananas, and the old salt shaker shaped like a wedding bell. It stayed there for hours, while I made tea, boiled rice, wiped the counter. Still, I didn't open it, because deep down, I already knew whatever was inside wasn't meant for me. Later that night, when Yolanda left to meet friends, I sat at the table again and slowly peeled back the seal. The pages were cold against my palms. Loan estimate, refinancing terms, projected escrow, and at the top, the address. My address. 305 East 146th Street, Apt PH 4. My breath caught at the signature block. Yolanda Delgado. Her handwriting was neat. A little too neat. Like she had practiced it. The date was last week. A Tuesday. I remembered that day. She'd made pancakes with almond flour and said we should try sugar-free. She'd smiled and poured me coffee in the blue mug, the one with the little chip. All the while, this. I turned the pages again, slowly, this time, letting the language sting. I didn't understand all the numbers, but I knew enough. She had used the apartment, my apartment, as collateral. I looked around, at the walls I had painted myself 30 years ago, at the curtain rods he installed crooked, but refused to fix. Because that's our signature. The floor creaked beneath my slippers as I stood up. But my voice, it didn't come. Not yet. I wasn't angry. Not then. Not even scared. What I felt was smaller than that. Like someone had erased my name with a single, quiet stroke, and didn't think I'd notice. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay on top of the blanket, fully clothed, with the bank papers folded neatly on the nightstand, like a secret I couldn't unsee. The shadows in the room felt unfamiliar, elongated, stretched thin by something I couldn't name. At one point, I got up and opened the hall closet. I needed to touch something solid. Old. The tin box with our tax receipts. The deed. Yellowed at the edges. Still tucked behind the envelope. From when we first closed on the apartment in '89. Back then, our names were side by side. His and mine. We signed it at a diner. After our third cup of coffee, laughing at the ketchup stain on the closing attorney's sleeve. Now, it was just me. And this ghost signature. That didn't belong. Yolanda came home late. Keys jangling like nothing had changed. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I watched her move through the kitchen. The way she checked her phone, while heating oat milk in the microwave. Completely at ease. She didn't look like someone who had stolen something. She looked comfortable. And that, somehow, was worse. I wanted to ask her, How she justified it. How she looked at my face each morning and still made calls behind my back. But the words wouldn't come. They got stuck somewhere between my chest and throat, like a zipper that wouldn't budge. So I sat at the table, the same table where we used to do puzzles, balance checkbooks, open holiday cards from relatives. Now, long gone. I traced the rim of my mug with one finger and stared at the grain of the wood. It had held so much. Spilled tea, laughter, arguments, prayers. Now it held a silence thick as honey. I turned to the window, watched as headlights from the street below moved in slow streaks across the ceiling, and I wondered, when did she start planning all this? Was it before the pancakes? Before the LED lights? Before she moved my radio station? Had it always been part of the plan? Or had it started the moment she realized I still had something she believed should belong to her? I don't know what hurt more, that she betrayed me, or that she never thought I'd be strong enough to notice. The next morning, I placed the loan papers on the kitchen counter. No dramatics. No confrontation. Just paper, neatly squared on the tile, between the sugar bowl and the spoon rest. She walked in, barefoot, yawning. I watched her eyes drop to the envelope, then flick back up to meet mine. A pause. Not long. Just enough to register that the silence had changed color. "Oh," she said. "I meant to talk to you about that." She poured coffee. 2 sugars. Almond milk. Stirred slowly. Like we were just 2 women discussing grocery coupons. I needed the paperwork done quickly. She continued. "The rates are changing next quarter. And you've always said, this place needs upgrades." I didn't answer. She leaned on the counter, as if we were on the same side of something. "It's still your home, Titi," she added with a small laugh. "Legally, nothing's changed. It's just a technical adjustment. On paper." She said that word. Paper. Like it was the only thing that mattered. Like a deed was something thin enough to fold and tuck into a drawer. She offered me toast. I declined. I walked back to my room, closed the door quietly, and sat on the edge of my bed, with the tin box in my lap. Inside, I found the old receipt for the down payment. April 1989. Bank certified. Signed in blue ink. 1100. My husband's handwriting. On the memo line. For us. I pressed my fingers over the letters, tracing them, like braille, from another life. She didn't see me for the rest of the day. That night, I took out the old accordion case from under the bed. The leather strap was dry, cracked with time. It smelled faintly of varnish and loss. I hadn't opened it in over a decade, but I wanted to hear the sound of something that still belonged to me. The first note wheezed out weak and trembling, but I kept pressing until the air caught, until the memory filled the room like a second spine. I played for no one, or maybe just to remind the walls I was still here. If your entire life savings were used by someone you trusted, and they called it just paperwork, what would you call it? I left at 7:14 in the morning. The apartment was still quiet, save for the soft whir of Yolanda's white noise machine leaking through her door. She had changed the lockbox code without telling me. The keypad blinked red twice last week, until I knocked. She let me in with a nervous smile, said she was testing new settings for security. I knew what that meant, so I packed before dawn. 3 blouses, 1 heavy cardigan, my prescription bottle, and the wedding photo I had rescued from the coat closet. I wrapped the frame in an old dish towel and placed it gently between my sweaters. The tin box came last. I held it to my chest for a long time, its sharp edge pressing into the place just below my collarbone. Not painful, just reminding me I still had weight. I didn't say goodbye. Yolanda would sleep another 2 hours. She'd wake to coffee and oat milk, and perhaps, for a moment, notice the stillness that comes when something is gone. Or maybe not. Maybe she wouldn't feel it at all. Miriam lived 3 subway stops away. A 1-bedroom apartment above a nail salon. She hadn't changed the curtains since 1996. Of course you can stay, she said. No questions. Just arms open, and tea already steeping on the stove. The guest room smelled of old books and lavender powder. The mattress was stiff, the sheets a little pilled, but it felt like shelter. And I didn't have to ask to be let in. I sat at the edge of the bed, facing the window, watching pigeons gather on the fire escape. As the Bronx blinked awake below, my hands rested on my lap, one cupped inside the other. Still, like I was holding something I couldn't name. I thought about all the mornings before this. The ones filled with music and burnt toast and his humming, off-key, but steady. Now, there was only the faint sound of traffic and my own heartbeat. Slow, steady, echoing in a body I no longer recognized. I pressed my thumb against the pulse in my wrist, just to check I was still here. But I felt like I'd stepped out of my life and into a hallway with no doors. Everything I had built now belonged to someone who didn't understand what it cost. And I had nowhere left to go home to. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. The guest room ceiling had a water stain in the shape of South America. I stared at it, like it might shift into something familiar, something mine. But nothing in that room belonged to me. Not the dresser with the broken drawer. Not the stiff sheets. Not even the lavender sachet tucked under the pillow. I was a guest. Even here. Around 2 a.m. I got up, wrapped the scarf around my shoulders, and wandered into Miriam's kitchen. The linoleum stuck softly to my socks. The fridge hummed low, like it was trying not to wake anyone. I made tea, the way I used to, before everything changed. Black, no sugar, just a hint of lemon, but it tasted like nothing. Like warm water with memory. I sat at the table, with both hands around the cup, and waited for something inside me to settle. Instead, I found myself reaching for the drawer where she kept the matches, the little ones, with the restaurant logos. We used to collect them, back when going out felt like celebration, back when life felt bigger than walls, and bills, and betrayal. There was one from a French cafe on 5th Avenue, a place he had taken me. After I signed my first solo commission, I struck the match, just to hear it hiss. That soft, quick sound of fire beginning. Then I let it burn down and die between my fingers. Not enough to hurt, just enough to remind myself I still had nerves. Under the quiet. The next morning, Miriam found me asleep at the table, my chin resting on my forearm. She placed a blanket over my shoulders and didn't ask any questions. Later, she set down a piece of toast and a folded piece of paper. "You don't have to read it now," she said gently. "But I know someone at housing court. Just in case." I looked at the envelope. For a long time, it felt heavy. Not in weight, but in possibility. Because up until that moment, I hadn't let myself imagine there was something left to fight for. I held it in my hand, not ready to open it, but no longer afraid to try. Then I walked back to the bedroom, opened the tin box, and took out the deed. Faded, but real, with my name, and his, still there. Proof that once, I had mattered. That once, I had built something no one else had the right to erase. When you lose everything you've ever known, do you still have yourself? Sunlight crept slowly across the edge of Miriam's kitchen table. As I sat, waiting for the kettle to boil, the old radio in the corner crackled softly between songs, sometimes breaking into static, before catching a familiar Motown tune. Now and then, a rain warning, blended with the music, gentle percussion on the glass. I wrapped my hands around the tea mug, chipped at the lip. The glaze faded from years of washing. It felt solid, anchoring me, a small weight I could actually hold, when everything else felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Miriam sat across from me, her hair pulled into soft gray waves, reading glasses sliding down her nose. As she searched the newspaper for coupons, the same way my mother once did. On long, quiet Sunday mornings. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence felt less like emptiness, and more like an old friend, one that could be trusted to keep secrets. Finally, she folded the paper, set it aside with a sigh, and looked at me. Eyes gentle, voice low and certain. "You know you're not the first," she said quietly. "My cousin lost her house to her own son. She just let it happen. Moved in with her daughter. Never said a word. Died that way, quiet. Unseen." The story was not new. I'd heard versions of it. From women at church. In the waiting room at the doctor's office. On the bus. The supermarket. It was a warning. Spoken in glances. In lowered voices. In sighs too heavy for words. Miriam reached out. Her fingers finding my wrist, where my pulse fluttered. Not as steady as it used to be. "Don't be like her, Corinne." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It pressed gently into my chest, just beneath my ribs. Like a promise. And a plea. I stared at my reflection in the tea. Steam curled upward, warping my face, making me look both older and younger at the same time. For a moment, I saw, not the woman who'd been erased, but the one who used to fight. For every stitch, every inch of silk, every trembling, hopeful bride that trusted me with her story. I used to believe I was made from strong fabric. Nothing could fray me, unless I allowed it. But somewhere along the line, I had loosened my grip on the thread. Miriam squeezed my hand, not letting go. Not until I met her eyes. "Forgive, if you can," she said. "But don't give them the story. Not if it's still yours to tell." Her words lingered in the air. Soft, unyielding, filling the room the way sunlight creeps into all the corners. No matter how long the curtains have been closed. I closed my eyes and let memory rise. The day my mother taught me to sew. Her hands guiding mine over the needle and cloth. Her voice steady. "Every mistake can be mended. But you must see it first, Nina." When I opened my eyes, the smell of morning rain hung sharp and clean against the window. Maybe it was time to look for the threads again. Not to forgive. Not yet. But to gather what was left. And begin, however quietly, to mend. After breakfast, Miriam left for work, leaving a note by the kettle. "Don't forget to eat lunch. Call me if you need anything. You're not alone." The apartment settled into its midday hush. Rain tapping steady rhythms on the fire escape. Soft and insistent. I wandered the small rooms, fingers trailing over the edges of framed photos. On the dusty sideboard, Miriam's wedding day. her son's graduation, an old snapshot of the two of us. At Coney Island, laughing, my arm around her waist, hair wild in the ocean wind. For a moment, I let myself remember how easy it used to be to feel like the world had space for us both. I walked to the guest room and sat on the bed, the tin box heavy in my lap. I hadn't opened it since the night I left home. My hands hovered over the lid, hesitant, almost afraid of what I might find inside. But I opened it anyway. Inside, paper memories waited for air. The deed, faded tax returns, our first phone bill in the apartment, a letter from my husband, with his sharp, swooping signature. We built this together, Corinne. Whatever happens, this is yours. I traced the lines with my thumb, feeling the indent where his pen pressed. Harder at the end of his name, beneath the papers, was a postcard. Paris, 1993. The year I bought the lace for our living room curtains. He had written, "I miss you. Don't forget to buy something soft for yourself." Tears pricked my eyes, not for what I'd lost, but for the proof that I had once been at the center of someone's world. I lifted the wedding photo, tilted it toward the gray light. Our faces, so hopeful, still looking out from behind the glass. After all these years, my throat tightened, but I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, I felt something loosen inside me, a gentle unraveling, not of grief, but of numbness. I wrapped the scarf around my shoulders, letting the faint, spicy scent settle into my skin. For the first time in weeks, I stood up straighter. I wasn't whole. Not yet. But I was beginning to remember what it meant to have a story that was still my own. That afternoon, the rain slowed, leaving the city washed and blinking in a softer light. I opened the window just an inch, enough to let in the cool air, and the distant hum of traffic, reminding me life was moving on, whether I chose to join it or not. I stood by Miriam's kitchen counter, sorting through the stack of papers. One last time, each document heavy with years, bearing witness to every hope and every fear I'd ever held close. My hands shook as I picked up the deed again, reading the name Shis, mine, printed side by side in dark blue ink. I remembered our first night in that apartment, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, with Chinese takeout, planning our future, as if the world belonged to us. Now the world felt so much smaller, but my name was still here. Not erased. Not yet. I wrote a list on a notepad. Everything worth saving. I wrote the deed, the wedding photo, the scarf, my story. I paused, pencil hovering, realizing how little I truly needed to reclaim myself. I poured another cup of tea, watching the steam curl upward, and let the scent of bergamot fill the space between grief and something new. A thought began to form, quiet but insistent. I did not have to forgive to move forward. I did not have to return home empty, just because someone tried to empty me. I sat by the window, letting memories drift in and out. With the changing light, Mom teaching me to thread a needle, the scratch of tulle on my wrists, the sound of my husband's voice, singing off-key while I worked. These were not just fragments. They were roots. Miriam called to check in. Her voice, steady and warm, was an anchor I hadn't realized I'd needed. "We don't always get to choose how we're remembered," she said, "but we can decide not to disappear." As dusk settled, I placed my hand over my heart and made a quiet promise. I would not fade. Not while I could still speak. Not while I could still choose. If the world tries to erase your story, will you let them? Or will you pick up the pen and rewrite it? The first thing I did was find an envelope. Not to send anything, just to hold the idea. that something could still begin. I folded the deed, the letter from my husband, and the photo, tucked them in slowly, like tucking in a child for sleep. Then I walked 2 blocks to the quiet print shop on Brook Avenue. The air inside smelled like ink and carpet glue. The man behind the counter wore headphones, but looked up when he saw me. "I need a copy," I said, placing the envelope down. He took the papers, without asking questions. The machine hummed, warm and steady. Each sheet came back to me, a little firmer, a little more real. I held them in my hand, like something solid again, like proof that I had not imagined my life. Miriam came home to find me at the kitchen table, sorting the copies into neat piles. She didn't interrupt, just poured me tea, and sat quietly, letting the sound of my paper stacks fill the room like music. That night, I called an old number. It belonged to Roslyn, a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She used to work in the clerk's office at the Bronx Civil Court. She was the one who taught me how to read fine print when we filled out forms for our husband's pensions. Her voice, when it came through the line, was raspy with age, but sharp as ever. "Corinne Delgado," she said. "Now there's a name I haven't heard since we had knees that didn't creak." We laughed. Genuine. Sudden. I hadn't heard my name spoken like that in so long. Not the way people say it, when they remember who you are, not just what you've become. I told her what happened. Not every detail, but enough. She didn't gasp, didn't pity me, just listened. Then she said, "You still have your name on the deed, yes?" "Yes." "And your tax records?" "All of them." "Then you have more than memory, Corinne. You have standing." That word, standing, settled in my spine, like something I'd forgotten I was allowed to have. She gave me the name of a woman at the legal aid clinic, told me to call in the morning, said to bring everything. I wrote it all down on the back of a grocery list. My handwriting was shaky, but legible. It had been a long time since anything I wrote felt like the beginning of something. The next morning, I wore my dark gray coat, the one with the loose lining, and the inside pocket that still held an old theater stub from a play he took me to 20 years ago. I walked slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to feel each crack in the sidewalk beneath my shoes. The legal aid clinic was on the corner of 138th and Willis. I hadn't been there in years, but the door still stuck slightly when you pulled it open, and the waiting room still smelled of copier toner and forgotten umbrellas. The woman at the front desk had a pin that said, "Maria," and a voice like she'd already heard 100 stories before mine. "I have a property issue," I said, placing my folder on the counter. She nodded. "Do you have documentation?" I opened the folder carefully, spreading the papers like a map of a place I refused to surrender. She looked through each page, without speaking, occasionally tapping a note into her computer. Finally, she said, "We'll get you an appointment. Someone will call within a few days." I thanked her, left the office, walked 3 more blocks, before sitting down on a bench beneath a half-blooming tree. The folder felt lighter now. Or maybe I had grown stronger. Later that evening, I stood in front of Miriam's hallway mirror, watching my reflection. As I buttoned my cardigan, it surprised me. Not how I looked, but how I stood. Shoulders not slumped, eyes not turned downward. I looked like a woman who had remembered. She didn't need permission to take up space. Miriam knocked gently on the doorframe. "You okay?" I nodded. "I did it." She smiled. Not big, not loud, but the kind that told me She was proud, and a little relieved, that I hadn't let this moment slip away. We sat together that night, without the TV, no music, just the sound of our teacups, clinking gently, against the ceramic saucers she had brought out, just for the occasion. She didn't say anything heroic. She didn't need to. Sometimes, dignity doesn't arrive with a bang. It shows up with steam from a kettle, and the steady hand of an old friend, passing you a napkin, when you didn't even realize you were crying. That night, I placed the folder on the nightstand beside me, and for the first time in weeks, I slept, without waking to check that I still existed. 3 days later, the call came. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Attorney Morales. Voice calm, measured, the kind of tone that could hold someone steady on the worst day of their life. I reviewed your file, she said. You have every right to pursue a quiet title action. The phrase settled into my ears, like a stone dropped in still water. Quiet title. Quiet. Like me. She explained the process. The forms. The timeline. What would be needed. I wrote everything down, even though I wouldn't forget. Not this. After we hung up, I opened the bottom drawer of Miriam's writing desk and pulled out the black pen I had always saved for signing important things. I filled out the affidavit line by line. Birth date. Property address. Years of continuous ownership. There was a space for explanation. I wrote slowly, my hand trembling only slightly. This property was purchased jointly with my late husband in 1989. It has been my home for over 3 decades. The current occupant does not hold legal claim. I didn't mention betrayal. Didn't mention her name. The law doesn't care for feelings, just facts and proof. I gathered everything, sealed the envelope, and placed it carefully in my canvas bag. The next morning, I returned to the same clerk's office Rosalind had once worked in. A different face behind the window now, but the same worn tile underfoot. The same scent of old paper and metal. I handed over the forms, paid the small fee, watched the clerk's red stamp to drop onto the page with a soft thud. That sounded, to me, like a heartbeat. When I stepped outside, the sky was clear, bright but not harsh. The kind of light that made every edge of the city feel newly drawn. I didn't go straight home. I walked 3 extra blocks to the florist and bought one single white lily. Not to forgive, not to mourn, but to mark the day. I remembered who I was. That night, Miriam found me at the table, staring out the window, hands steady around a cup of tea. She sat across from me and asked, "Did you do it?" I nodded. Yes. It's in motion now. She didn't say anything, just lifted her cup in quiet salute. And I realized, sometimes the strongest sound is no sound at all. When silence is your greatest weapon, will they ever see it coming? The courthouse was colder. Then I remembered. Not the kind of cold you feel on your skin, but the kind that lives in marble floors and fluorescent lights that buzz faintly overhead. I arrived early. Too early. The hallway outside the courtroom was still empty, except for a janitor pushing a cart and a young woman flipping through a clipboard. I sat on the wooden bench, with my canvas bag resting on my lap. The same one I used to carry fabric samples, now holding something heavier. Proof. Inside were copies of the deed, tax returns, letters with my name on them, written in his hand, and the photograph. The photograph I almost left behind. Our hands linked. His smile just slightly off-center, like he was caught mid-laugh. I took it out, just for a moment, to remind myself why I came. At 9:03, a court clerk opened the door and called my name. I stood, knees stiffer than usual, but spine straight. I walked past the empty rows of pews, toward the front of the room, where a folding table waited. The judge wasn't there yet, but Yolanda was. She turned when she saw me. Her mouth opened slightly, not in surprise, but something close to irritation, like I had interrupted something. She wore a blazer I didn't recognize, and makeup she never used to bother with. There was no one sitting beside her. No lawyer. No one holding her hand. That made two of us. The clerk pointed me to the other table. I sat down, unzipped the bag, laid out my documents. In slow, careful movements. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The judge entered. A middle-aged woman, with gray at her temples, and reading glasses she wore low on her nose. She greeted us without smiling, asked us to state our names. For the record, when it was my turn, I said it clearly. Corinne Delgado. The name didn't tremble in my mouth. It landed clean. On the courtroom air. The judge turned to Yolanda. Miss Delgado, are you representing yourself today? Yolanda hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Her voice was thinner than I expected. The judge opened the file. Her eyes moved silently across the page, and I sat, hands folded, waiting. Not to be rescued, not to be praised, but to be heard. The judge looked up from the file and asked me to begin. I stood slowly, holding the folder in both hands, like it was a fragile kind of truth that had waited too long to be spoken. I've lived at 305 East, 146th Street, Apt, PH4, since 1989, I said, my voice even. My name is on the original deed, along with my late husband's. I handed the clerk the copy, the red stamp still fresh from legal aid. The judge reviewed it, then nodded for me to continue. I laid out each piece like a memory. I had cleaned and ironed, just for this moment. Tax documents, utility bills, insurance renewals, all with my name. This property was never transferred, I said. I never signed it away. I was never notified of any mortgage application. The documents were submitted without my knowledge or consent. I could hear my own breathing. Even the court reporter had stopped typing for a second. The judge looked back at Yolanda. Do you have any documentation that shows permission was granted for this refinancing? Yolanda shifted in her chair. I don't have the paperwork with me. The judge raised an eyebrow. Did your aunt sign anything? Yolanda opened her mouth, closed it again. No, Your Honor. But I thought. She told me once. She was tired of keeping up with things. She said she trusted me. The words landed in the room, like broken glass. I didn't flinch. Didn't argue. Instead, I reached into the folder and pulled out one last page. My husband's letter, dated 2 months before he passed. In it, he wrote, Corinne built this home from the floor up. She made it ours. No one else has the right to take that from her. The judge read it silently, then passed it back. And in that pause, that held breath moment, where no one spoke, I realized something. I wasn't here to win. I wasn't here to punish her. I was here to reclaim what should never have been put in question. The judge adjusted her glasses. Thank you, Miss Delgado, she said. I have what I need. I sat back down, hands in my lap, heart not racing, but steady. Outside the window, a tree branch tapped against the glass, soft and rhythmic. It was the only sound that didn't try to interrupt what had just been returned to me. The judge glanced at the clock, then back at us. This is a quiet title matter, she said. But there's nothing unclear about the facts. She looked directly at Yolanda. There is no valid transfer. There is no record of consent. The mortgage was filed under false pretenses. Yolanda sank lower into her chair. Her mouth tightened. But no words came out. The judge turned to me. Miss Delgado, your documents are complete. The property remains under your sole name. Any attempts to alter that status will be considered invalid and subject to civil penalties. She didn't smile. Judges don't. But her tone softened. As she added, I recommend you file for injunctive relief. Just to be safe. I nodded. Once. Not too quickly. I wanted to remember this moment. For what it was. Not a victory. But a return. A restoration. The sound of the gavel was not loud. Just one precise knock. That echoed. Like a bell through the wooden room. Then silence. Yolanda gathered her purse slowly. Avoiding my eyes. We stood at the same time. I didn't approach her. And she didn't move toward me. There were no apologies. No confessions. Only air. Suddenly thick. With everything that hadn't been said. I walked past her. The same way I had walked past the mirror. Days before. Steady. Shoulders square. No need to look back. Outside. The courthouse steps were damp. From a morning shower. Sunlight had returned. But left the stone warm and slick underfoot. Miriam was waiting near the crosswalk. Hands in her coat pockets. Eyes searching for me in the crowd. She didn't ask. She didn't have to. When I reached her, she touched my elbow lightly. And said, let's get you something sweet. We walked 2 blocks. To the bakery with the checkered floor. The one that still smelled of cinnamon and sugar. I ordered a lemon tart. Something small. Something mine. Back at her place. I placed the court documents in the drawer. Beneath her old tablecloths. And for the first time in weeks, I exhaled. Without fear of being erased again. The apartment was still the same. Old, uneven, a little too quiet. But this time, the quiet didn't feel like loss. It felt like space. Like choice. Like air. Finally returned. To the lungs that had forgotten how to ask for it. Is this justice? Or is it too harsh? What would you have done? I didn't move back to the apartment. Not because I had lost it. But because it no longer held the kind of silence I could live inside. Some silences feel like being buried. Others feel like being held. I chose the second. Miriam's spare room became mine for a while longer. She added a small lamp to the nightstand, brought me a stack of old sewing magazines. From the 90s. And never once asked when I planned to go. It was spring by then. The trees on her street had begun to shed their blossoms like soft confetti, and the city took on that rare, forgiving light. It only holds for a few weeks each year. One morning, I took the accordion out of its case. The straps had stiffened, but the bellows still breathed, like lungs that had never quite given up. I didn't play it like I used to. There was no need. I let it make sound. On its own terms. Short, broken notes. That filled the apartment. And startled the neighbor's cat. It made Miriam laugh. The kind of laugh that doesn't ask for permission. And for the first time in years, I laughed too. One afternoon, I began sorting through the tin box again. Not to file away, but to decide what to carry forward and what to release. The wedding photo stayed. So did the deed, now stamped, notarized, untouched by anyone else's ambition. But the receipts? The utility bills? The old bank statements? I let them go. One by one. Into the recycling bin. Without ceremony. Without regret. Some things are proof. Others are weight. I no longer needed both. In April, I received a letter. from a local history group. They had found my name through a community archive and wanted to interview me about the old days of garment work in Manhattan, specifically the bridal houses on 5th Avenue. I almost said no, but then I remembered how many names never made it into the record. And I thought, maybe dignity isn't something you keep. Maybe it's something you leave behind. Like a trail, a scent, a whisper that someone else can follow when the world tries to forget them too. So I said yes. They came with a microphone and gentle questions. I answered what I could, skipped what still stung, and when they asked if I had anything I wanted to add, I reached under Miriam's table and pulled out a swatch of ivory lace from the box I'd never quite unpacked. This, I said, placing it in their hands, was the last piece I ever stitched for a bride. She never came to pick it up, but I never threw it away. They smiled, wrote something down. I don't know what they'll do with it. Maybe nothing. But for once, it didn't matter, because I had remembered something I feared I'd lost for good. I still had something worth passing on. It was almost summer when I finally bought the sewing table. Not new, but solid. Oak, with a drawer that stuck, and legs that creaked like knees in the morning. I placed it by Miriam's front window, where the light poured in soft and golden, for 3 full hours each afternoon. I didn't plan to take commissions. Didn't need the money. But I began repairing things. A hem, a torn pocket, a sleeve stretched too far by time. Sometimes they were Miriam's, sometimes mine. There was something sacred about touching fabric again. Not for survival, not for someone else's deadline, just for the rhythm of needle and thread, passing through something worn and making it whole again. One afternoon, a knock came at the door. It was a young woman, nervous, holding a linen dress with a split seam, and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. She'd heard from someone that an older lady upstairs still knows how to sew. I almost laughed, almost said, "I'm retired." But instead, I opened the door wider and said, "Let me take a look." She stood there as I ran my fingers along the frayed edge. Her voice shook as she explained it was for a memorial service. Her mother had passed. The dress had belonged to her. I told her I'd have it ready by morning. After she left, I sat at the table, holding the cloth in my lap. Like a whisper, I threaded the needle slowly, my hands moving, as if guided by memory, more than muscle. And as the stitches pulled tight, as fabric found itself again, I realized this too was a kind of justice. Not the kind stamped by a court or signed by a judge, but the quiet kind that comes from being able to help someone else carry their grief with a little more dignity. When the young woman returned, she didn't cry. She just touched the seam, whispered, "Thank you," and left, with the dress pressed gently to her chest. That night, I opened the window above the sewing table. The city below was soft with light, muffled in the way only early summer allows. I made tea, chamomile, and sat in silence. Not the silence of absence, the silence of return. I took the swatch of lace the historians didn't keep, and pinned it gently to the corner of the curtain, not as proof, but as presence. A reminder that I had been here, fully, quietly, unmistakably. The next morning, I wrote my name in a clean notebook. No title, no deadline, just a blank page, waiting to remember that every story is a second chance. To all the women listening who have been pushed aside, quieted, or made to believe they no longer matter, your voice is still here. Your memory holds weight. And your story? It's not over yet. We invite you to share your story below. You are not alone in this. Subscribe to Kamar FM, where every story is a second chance.